Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today on a very interesting webinar. Today I'm going to talk about online planning. Do you like planning? Actually, do you plan? And the most important question is, do you plan online? Join me through this webinar and you will find some answers and very good ideas about online planning right now, right here, during this time in which we need to actually plan on an online format. My name is Abdel Jacobo and thank you for watching us. The goals for the lesson. What are you going to learn today? Well, today we are going to identify the best approaches, strategies, and tools for planning online. Gain practical insights to make the best planning decisions while teaching online courses. And 3, identify the best practices and media for useful, meaningful, and efficient planning. Okay, before I continue, for some of you, the terms we're going to talk about maybe are new, so I'm going to refer some useful terms. LMS, or Learning Management System. I have some examples: Blackboard, Google Classroom, Schoology, Algebraics, Edmodo, among others. Probably you're familiar to some, probably you're not. Probably you use one particular LMS in your class or in your school, but this is what I refer to when I talk about LMS, Learning Management System. As well, I'm going to talk about G Suite or Google Suite or Google Docs. As you know, these are part of Google, and in order to work with, you need to have a Google account. Before we continue, this is a very good idea. Have you ever thought about planning as cooking? So if we think about education like cooking, planning is the same as writing down the recipe. Why? Because you had to get all your ideas together, you had to combining your ingredients, the time you're going to cook, how you're going to do it, what tools you're gonna need in order to perform or to make a cake or that particular dish. We write it down and then we follow the steps as we wrote them down. So planning will be that particular stage, getting all together and put it on a format in order to later on read that format or read that recipe, and then we're gonna have a very interesting product. Okay, so what about if we see planning as cooking? Well, we have both sides, the teacher and the learner. The first part in which we had to get together all the ingredients is the diagnostic assessment. It means we had to know exactly where our students are, and as well our students or the learner, they have to demonstrate that the learning, the prior learning, what they have learned before, and that's what we're gonna have in order to develop the new learning or the new knowledge. We are going to take in consideration those ingredients for our planning or for our class. Those are the ingredients. And then, as I said, you have the recipe. You have to write down what you have, the ingredients, the time, the tools, everything, put it together, because then the teacher, you as teacher, you need to plan learning, okay? Based on communicative objectives. That is going to be the recipe. And for the learner, they had to work in their attitude towards my objectives, my communicative objectives. And also, of course, we're going to get a response from them, a behavior. That's how we are going to actually plan ahead, thinking about our students' behaviors, responses, the attitude towards my planning. And then cooking, it's performing the class. It's when you facilitate learning, and then you have the class on an online format. This is where you connect to your students through LMS or Zoom or Google Team or Microsoft Teams or any platform that you are interacting with your students and you're trying to facilitate your students learning. That's the class, not at the class stage. But at the same time, as part of the cooking, as when you are developing the knowledge and developing everything, putting all together in order that learning happens, then you have to have an assessment, right? Because you want to be sure your students are learning as when you are explaining. And for our learners, they had to demonstrate learning. In that interaction on that stage, our students actually demonstrate if they are learning or not. And what way is doing the formative assessment. And if we compare with cooking, as I say, like cooking, it's when you are, tasting the soup and trying everything in order to make sure that what you're doing is going to be the way you thought about it. And finally, you have everything finished, you have your recipe, you have your product, you have your dish, and then you have to have an assessment on an online format, for example, in this case. And it's when your students demonstrate what they have learned, that achieve learning. So as you can see, it's a full circle. So we have the assessment, and then our students demonstrate what they have learned before, and then we put everything together as an ingredient, because then we plan, that's going to be our recipe. Our students are going to respond, to show an attitude towards my planning. And then I perform the class, I facilitate learning through different strategies, online strategies. And remember that I'm developing a series of webinars and tutorials for you, video tutorials to help you out, to facilitate learning through different platforms, resources, apps, web pages. But that's the stage in which you have to perform the class. And then you have to have a formative assessment, because this is a continuous process in the learning process, and your students have to demonstrate learning. And finally is when you conclude the process by tasting, by trying what they have learned in a summative assessment, and your students have to demonstrate in terms of communication, of course, because we teach languages. Okay, that's the final product. But before I continue, I have some questions for you. Key questions. I understand, and I think that improving our planning begins with recognizing the way I normally plan my lessons. That's the first stage. I have to take my lesson plan, and then I have to see the way I plan. First of all, do I plan? Okay, I'm going to see that on the questions. But the way I plan. My question will be, do I actively plan for communicative objectives in each of my lessons or units? In terms of communication, because we are language teachers, so communication has to be our goal. So is my planning like that? Check it out. Am I planning purposefully, or I'm just following textbook sequences? That's very interesting. As you know, sometimes I have class observation. I go and observe classes of other teachers among the whole country, so I travel a lot. And then when I go and see a class and I tell teachers to give me the lesson plan, they usually have planning, and that's the objective, no? To cover page 100 to 120 on a month or a unit. So they're just following a sequence. They just take in the textbook, got the sequence, and they plan in terms of finishing the book. Yes, I understand that parents and administrators and the school, they want you to finish the book, or at least use the book. But the idea is, I'm planning with a purpose. I'm using that sequence in order to develop communicative objectives. That's gonna be my goal. Not only following the sequence just because. Think about it. And my last question, which is referring to this webinar, do I know what to do with my online classes? Think about it. Most of us, we don't know, because this was just so quickly and it took us by surprise. We didn't know how to plan on an online format, and it is becoming harder and harder because the students are demanding, schools are demanding, and we don't know when we're gonna return to our classes, but we are trying the best we can, using the resources we actually know, we are familiar to. But how am I planning? Am I just using platforms because I have to? Am I just using videos because I have to? So you have to think about, and I think this is where everything begins. Planning. That's why I'm dedicating a whole webinar about planning, online planning. All right. What is planning with a purpose? We have to start from there. So planning begins with recognizing what our objectives are, right? So look at your lesson plans and see if you can easily recognize your objectives. We talk about communicative objectives, so consider that. And you have to think about and check it out. You have to check if our objectives, they are realistic and carefully considered. So they will tell us how my lesson plan should be like. Objectives are very important. That's planning with a purpose. If I don't have an objective, my planning will be just a format and an administrative requirement that I had to make, that I had to do as my teacher's duties. But think about that. My objectives, are they really, do they have a purpose? On talking about communicative terms, right? Now, what about objectives in language teaching? Because I'm a language teacher, most of you are language teachers. So how can I plan thinking about communicative objectives? We have to divide into, let's say, general categories: language skills and language systems. We have to identify when my objectives are referring to reading, listening, speaking, and writing. And I'm going to dedicate another very interesting webinar about developing skills in an online class, right? So we have to think about language skills, and then we have language systems on the other hand. We have grammar, which includes tenses, aspects, structures, vocabulary, which includes words, chunks, expressions, phonology, sounds, intonation, rhythm, and then functions, purposes of a specific language, and then it is associated with those bits of language. Okay, so we have to check carefully if my objectives are just developing, or let's say just following a sequence, as I said, finishing a unit, finishing a page, completing certain amount of pages, or we have objectives in which we develop language skills and language systems, and we can do it online. I'm going to show you how, so go on. All right, this is a graphic representation about planning. Okay, you can have, I see it as a path. Well, making another analogy, let's move away about cooking, but what about, going through a path? So in planning, you have to develop competencies, which is our, understanding, knowledge, and skill, which sometimes refer as performance standards. And then we can have under planning the direct teaching, right? That moment in the class when you are connecting with your students, seeing through the camera, and then you're teaching a lesson, right? And you have learning activities formative assessment as well. Assessment is crucial through the whole planning process, because planning gives us information to help adjusting the course towards learning objectives. Think about that. In that way, we make a differentiation and learning plan adjustments, because planning is not static. Through the path, we see if the teaching or the activities are meeting my students' needs, or I am achieving my objective, I am developing my students' understanding, knowledge, and skills. And if it's not, I can always make adjustments. That's very interesting about planning. You don't have to keep with a lesson plan. You just can, change it a little, improve it, adapt it. That's a very good thing about planning. So remember one more time, planning gives us information to help adjusting the course towards learning objectives. Adjusting the course. And right now we're working with the course online version. Alright, here I have a very interesting contrast between planning, on a traditional format, face-to-face in the classroom, and on an online format. So, in my classroom, I plan to develop competency. How can I do it online? Well, I can have online quizzes, exams, LMS, as I mentioned before, as Google Forms, Kahoot, Socrative, Quizlet, Edpuzzle, among others, right? I'm going to explore those on different tutorials, so stay tuned on my YouTube channel and Facebook as well. I'm going to keep going, developing strategies and to help you to get familiar with those platforms or LMS. If you're planning in your classroom about integrated skill tasks, for example, students' oral presentation, debates, writing tasks, well, online, what you can do for oral presentations are video chats, a YouTube video, WhatsApp voice message, Powtown, etc. I'm going to explain that little by little, like I said, the different tutorials, because otherwise this webinar would be about 3 hours or so. Debates, LMS discussion forums, Flipgrid, Workplace, and Twitter, for example. Writing, you can use Google Docs, Slides, Tumblr, Blogger, etc. And you are developing integrated skills on your students. And if you plan project-based, well, we can ask your students to work on the stage of planning on that project using Google Docs, Padlet, Google Forms, etc. And then the collaboration stage, they can work on a Google document, Google Classroom, Discord, or use a video chat. And then for the presentation, they have now to present to you. So they can use as well Google Docs or a Prezi or YouTube or video chat, among others. So as you can see, we can work mostly the same way we work in a traditional classroom setting, planning, but just translate and think on the platforms, apps, or resources are gonna be useful and they fit in your planning, right? And I know sometimes technology could be scary and we are not familiar probably with those platforms or those web pages. What we have to do is experiment, try, look for tutorials like the ones I'm going to develop. If you don't know how to use Kahoot, for example, look for a tutorial about Kahoot and how can you see other teachers working with Kahoot in order to develop a competency, for example. Planning online. Well, I try actually, and I'm asking you to try this model, right? At the very top of the planning, you have to think about in terms of learning. As I mentioned, objectives, goals. That's very important. And then my teaching. When you're planning, think about this idea of my teaching. So, is it what I'm planning right now? Let's say I'm gonna use Google Forms, for example. Is it really helping in terms of my learning goals? And then if I plan to use Google Forms, or is it my planning, what I'm planning to do, is it now occurring or it's meeting my teacher's workload? Do I have to make an extra effort? Do I have to learn, to research, to see videos, to watch videos, and to interact with other teachers? So is this actually going to help me or give me a little more of a stress? What about the equipment? Maybe I'm going to use that particular resource, but I don't have the equipment. I don't have a computer. I don't have a very sophisticated smartphone, or the skills as well. Do I have the skills to use that resource? Call it, the computer, the web page, the app. And then the most important question, when I plan and then I ask my students, for example, to record a YouTube video, can I provide support on the questions or about technology or technical support, because I am very familiar to it? So think about that. Workload, the equipment, and the skills. Do I have them? And can I provide support to my students on that particular tool that I'm planning to use on my online classes? Software. One more time. If you plan in a class, is this software accessible? Sometimes teachers, we ask for very sophisticated software because we saw a video or we know a teacher is using it, and maybe it works in his or her environment, but is it for free? Do my students have to pay? Is it accessible? Can I download it? Think about it. Is that software going to solve for my learning, my teaching problems or what I'm proposing? Can the software do it? Is it compatible? Is it easy to use? Do students know it? So you don't have to plan very, very complicated online classes trying to incorporate software or resources, technology. If you don't know how to use it yourself, you can provide support. And also about your students. Think about that. And what about hardware? Do the teacher or students have it? Is it accessible? Is it capable? So plan your lessons using these criteria. On the very top, the learning, okay, my learning goals, and then go through my teaching. Is it going to help me or probably give me more workload or more stress? Think about that. Do I have the skills? And then the software. Is it accessible? Do the students know the software? Is it easy to use? And finally, the hardware. One more time, is it accessible? My students have it, right? Maybe you are requesting for a very specific app, and then my students have a computer that is old. So how can I work with? So these criteria, these ideas are going to help you with your plans. Very important. And I have an example. Let's talk about science. I don't know. I had to work a project in science. I'm going to develop, the competency, understanding, knowledge, and skills. And then I had to ask myself, the question for my students in my planning, right? So I'm thinking about the project. So the question would be, how does science reflect a personal vision of the world? How can we relate science on a personal level? That's a question. That's what the project is about. And then I'm planning about language. Probably I'm going to include on my planning, or I'm expecting my students use adjectives to describe science, expressions to give opinions, expressions to agree or disagree. What about grammar? In this case, maybe I'm going to plan, and I'm expecting my students to use the past tense questions. And then I had the skills. Reading, my students understand text describing inventions and their background. And then writing, students can write a short outline for their video. All right, the script, what they have to do. And then speaking and listening, the students can describe an invention, ask for others' opinions, and disagree with others. So this is how my planning should be in a general way. No? The main idea, what I'm expecting my students to do, and then language and skills. Remember that we had to plan in those terms. Language skills and language systems in order to develop competencies or performances. Remember my graphic? So this is how my lesson plan will be, right? So at the end of the path, I have the project about science, and on my direct teaching, probably I'm going to use a video lesson on Edpuzzle. I'm going to use YouTube, any particular resource you want to use, but you have the video lesson for my direct teaching, and you explain about science, and then you have the learning activities. It could be a vocabulary, which is a very interesting resource to work with vocabulary, in this case for adjectives to describe science. And another activity will be a Socrative race, grammar. Remember, I'm going to use past tense. And then the video chat lesson about science. So I'm developing some activities for that particular project. And then part of the assessment, because remember that I'm planning, I had to have the assessment. In this case, it's going to be formative. I'm going to use Kahoot challenges about vocabulary and grammar, or voice notes, dialogues. They can express opinions or phrases, and finally written the video outline. Okay, and on the path through the activities that I'm doing, I can always have reinforcement about language, maybe about technology. I can always back and forth on my direct teaching on a video chat, for example, to explain even about the project, even about science, about grammar, about language, about vocabulary, or even about technology. What they're gonna use to help them to use that particular resource. So, how can I make sure my lesson plan is a good planning? Reflect. Check your lesson plan. Are my learning objectives requiring understanding of language or a text of a context? So understanding. Okay, so learning objectives are very important. So are they requiring a level of understanding of a language or of a text of a context? Authentic use of skills. Language skills. Speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Are they using it in an authentic way? Tasks are challenging for students. Yes, they have to be challenging enough, but not impossible, especially with technology. So how challenging will be in terms of language, in terms of using technologies, or in terms of use or developing a project, for example. So think about students understand criteria for assessment. So in my lesson plan, I had to reflect my assessment criteria, and my students have to understand what I'm expecting from them in terms of language, in terms of knowledge, of understanding, of skills, or even so about the use of technology. But they had to know what precisely I am expecting from them. And finally, implementations conditions are authentic, adequate, and appropriate. As I said, there's no purpose of planning a very good lesson with technology that is not available right now in your context. Maybe you heard about Kahoot and everyone is using Kahoot and it's fun and students love it. But if in my context, my students hardly have, internet, or it's a difficult way to interact in a Kahoot format with them, the conditions are not authentic and it's gonna fail. Believe me, everything is gonna fail. So think about that. Implementation conditions. Plan realistic. Okay? So don't push too hard yourself, thinking that you had to use that particular technology or resource or web page or app because everyone is doing it. Maybe you can plan in a very different way, not using that specific resource because it's not your condition right now. I think that's the most important piece of advice I can give you too. Be realistic about your conditions when you're planning an online class. Alright, I have some tips. You have to program your class wisely. Use your time, structured way. If you have 15 minutes lesson on a direct teaching way, plan, having the warm-up and then the challenge and then the wrap-up. But don't try to cover everything and don't try to use that time explaining technology when the most important part probably is the language, So you have to program wisely. And then you're teaching. Something that it has worked for me is use Google Classroom or Drive. I use it a lot with my students before this transition. On my regular classes, on my face-to-face classes, I use Google Classroom or I use Google Drive so my students can, instead of sending homework through email, sometimes it's complicated, do it on the Drive, do it on the Classroom. In the past I used Schoology. You can use Schoology or Blackboard, okay? But in my case, for me, it is easier to use Google Classroom, so try it. I developed a series of tutorials last week about using Google Forms, and eventually I'm going to develop some for Google Classroom. So you can check one more time my YouTube channel in order to find those tutorials. Integrate skills. As for audio, video recording, right now TikToks, they're very popular. Well, maybe it's a way it's a way your students will speak, making a TikTok or a WhatsApp video or Facebook Live. But in that way, you will integrate the skills because they had to develop the online, what they're gonna do, and then do it. And then probably they get feedback and they listen. And probably they have to write about the experience. So you are integrating the skills in one project using video or audio in your lessons. Writing and reading. Ask them for written assignments, as I said, on Google Forms, which is one of my favorites, or Schoology, or Blackboard, or Moodle, any LMS you decide. But it has to be a written assignment, and also readings to develop, integrate skills. Something that is working for me right now is a signed contract with the students on the use of translators. Try it. So you tell them how important it's for them to develop language skills. And I understand you're not there checking, monitoring, and observing if they are using a translator or not, or other tools or help. Consider making a contract, signing a contract with your students. It will help eventually, believe me, it has worked for me, because I always refer to the contract. When I notice that they send me assignments that they use a translator, I talk to them and I tell them, remember that we had a contract and you promised and you signed that you won't use it. So please, next time, don't use it because it's on the contract. Think about it. All right? And something very important, when you're planning and you have questions or issues or doubts, share ideas with fellow teachers. It always works. There are a lot of communities of teachers out there on Facebook groups. There are communities of teachers that are coping and dealing with the same situation. So probably they have fantastic ideas, fantastic strategies or suggestions to work with. And you as well, probably you can provide ideas or suggestions to other teachers the way I am doing it. That's why I am developing this series of webinars. Because on my regular training, I work as a trainer. That's my full-time job. And they pay me to it. But I go to the school and I train, and then I have courses, and then I go and observe, and then I'm a full-time teacher trainer, but on a face-to-face. So I decided to share these ideas on an online format because I've seen it. The teachers are struggling. The teachers are dealing with something new, and most of us weren't prepared. So that's why I'm sharing. Share. You can do this. Do webinars to help other teachers. Okay? So as a promise, I keep my webinars short, my lessons short, because I want you to get the most of it. Very general ideas, very specific strategies, because I am going to develop little by little tutorials on different resources. As I said, I have a series of tutorials about Google Forms, and then I'm going to work on Kahoot, and then I'm going to work on Google Classroom. This is going to be little by little, and eventually what I'm planning is to take everything together, right, in a very big, huge program, and probably to have a course, maybe a 1-week course for free for teachers to help them to cope and develop strategies to teach online. And why not, when we go back to normality, keep that momentum and keep those strategies in our regular classes, and maybe we can have face-to-face interaction. Maybe I can train teachers on a face-to-face format using technology in your classes, right? So remember that we are sponsored by the Met, the Metropolitan English and Teach Fund, which is my page, my Facebook page, in which I share the strategies and I share more ideas. This is my personal email, and this is my WhatsApp. So feel free to contact me in case you have more questions or suggestions about webinars. I have my YouTube channel, Teach Fund, so look for it. And well, thank you for watching us. This is a very important project for me, and please share with teachers. I will see you soon on another very interesting webinar.